Welcome back. It's another episode of the Better Learning Podcast. Today I have with you Matt Hansen, who's in Pittsburgh, and we've been talking a little bit about his involvement and how he got into architecture and some of the issues and challenges and opportunities that are going on in Pittsburgh. So we were going to talk about some of that. So Matt, first, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yeah. Would you mind giving a little bit of your background? And I love hearing people's experience. What was school like for you?
Yeah, so I went to school actually in Western Canada. I grew up in...
You're Canadian?
I'm Canadian, yes. Right. Somewhere between Edmonton and Calgary, there's a little town called Rocky Mountain House, and it's just a little town of 6,000 people. There was a public school there, and there was a Catholic school there. I am not Catholic, so I went to the public school. The school was old when I went there. It's since been demolished and replaced, fortunately, but it was not a learning environment that looks anything like what I aspire to design for my clients. But I did have what I would consider a great education. So I think there's a good lesson there that while the environment is critically important, I believe it's important, the people that carry that education forward and educate young people are equally as important, if not more important. So all aspects come into play when it comes to the educational experience.
Yeah. So did school come naturally to you, or what was that experience really like?
Parts of it did, yeah. Not chemistry. I was never going to be a chemist by any means. I was always very much a hands-on learner. I like the activities, the fine arts class, shop class. Those were always in my wheelhouse. I did well in math and some of the other core subjects too. But if I had my choice, I'd go down to the wood shop and play around and make things. And I think that was really my origin story. I got that from my dad, who was always messing around in the garage, and my grandfather was very like-minded too. So yeah, I think I come by that honestly and was able to cultivate that into a subset of my career.
So as you were going through school and getting into in the high school age where you had to figure out the next step, what did you already know your plan, or at what point did you kind of figure out where you wanted to focus?
I kind of knew where I was headed from the first grade. And that sounds kind of ridiculous because in no way did I really understand what architecture was in the first grade. But I had a teacher who noticed that I had some trouble paying attention and liked to draw and liked to doodle and had my mind on other things on a more creative path when she's trying to teach me, how to read and how to put verbs together and other sentence structure elements that really didn't have any interest for me. And she made the comment, "You're going to be an architect one day." And
that's amazing. First grade.
And it stuck. It really did seem curious. I asked, what does an architect do? And at that point, my understanding was architects build the houses that you live in and the places that you like to visit. And that sounded pretty cool. So I just adopted that mentality. And as I grew older and learned more about what architecture was, I remained interested in it and wanted to pursue that. And when it was time to go to school, and then that experience absolutely reaffirmed that I was on the right trajectory and was in the right place for what I was wanting to do with my professional life.
So how'd you end up from Canada to Pittsburgh?
Well,
was it a straight line?
It was actually. There was an influence. So I'm Canadian. We established that. I'm also a cliche Canadian. So I played hockey, and when I went to college, I played on the club team there. One of my teammates had an uncle who was an architect in Manhattan. That's all he told me. And at some point, I was going to need an internship, and he offered to hook me up with his uncle. And so his uncle called me one day and said, Ted was home for Thanksgiving. He talked to us about you and said you'd be interested in an internship. And I'm thinking Manhattan. Who wouldn't want to have their first job in architecture in Manhattan? So his uncle turned out to be Brad Perkins of Perkins Eastman Architects.
Oh, wow.
Pretty notable organization, globally known organization. And I had no idea how important his uncle was. He was Brad, and we talked on the phone, and I told him about the frat party I had been to the night before, and we just had a really great conversation. And he, learning a little bit about me and understanding the small town that I came from, and I went to a school that was a larger school, but in a small town as well. He kind of had some wise advice that Manhattan might be a big jump. They had an office in Pittsburgh that was looking for interns at that time, and he offered to connect me with the Pittsburgh office. And that's kind of how it happened. I ended up at the Pittsburgh office. Things went great the first summer. They were nice enough to invite me back for a second summer, and they hired me out of college. So that's my Pittsburgh story.
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
I've been here ever since.
Yeah, and a good hockey town too. I feel like we can talk the rest of the time about hockey if you want.
Yeah, we've got some notable figures here that are fun to watch for sure.
Yeah. So what year did you move there to Pittsburgh?
That was 2002. So
okay.
the first internship would have been 2000, then 2001 was the second, and then 2002 I graduated. I also met my wife at that same firm. She's not an architect, but was a marketing intern. And then once you marry somebody from Pittsburgh, you're just automatically from Pittsburgh for the rest of time. And so,
I spent some time there a few months ago, and I was learning all the yins and kind of all the different things that the different cultural aspects of Pittsburgh.
Absolutely,
which is crazy because I lived for a long time in Columbus, which is Ohio, which is only like 2.5, 3 hours away.
Right.
But it is interesting just the cultural differences, but there's so many people from Pittsburgh. Columbus was a weird mix because, especially for like pro sports, other than the Blue Jackets, our hockey team there, the other pro sports, it was really split surprisingly between Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Like there were
and probably usurping all of those is Ohio State, right? I mean,
of course,
fan.
I mean,
the entire state,
exactly. I mean, it's Ohio State football year round, and then and then the other 100%. Pro sports kind of
we do a lot of work. We do a lot of work in Morgantown, West Virginia, too, and that state doesn't have any pro sports teams, and so the Mountaineers are
that's right. West Virginia.
That's it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. So going through that track then with architecture, did you have a specialty, or were you working kind of variety of different types of projects through other?
No, I mean, I ended up at firms that had predominant specialties. So with Perkins Eastman, it was senior housing and senior care facilities, which I love the people that I worked with. There's definitely some room for some creative ideas, and they were doing really great work, but it was not a passion of mine and not something that I saw myself doing long term. I moved over to IKM after a couple of years at Perkins because IKM had a healthcare focused practice and a well-established healthcare focused practice. And I thought that was taking the technical aspects of the health care component of senior housing and accelerating that. And I was interested in that, and I was able to jump right into that and do a lot of really interesting work in the on the healthcare side, learning a lot about some of the research that goes into making great spaces for healing, et cetera. And it was only by chance that I ended up in education out of that. The school district that I lived in had a building project. They were going to be replacing a high school and a middle school. And I had a friend that sat on that school board who encouraged me to help out and sit on the community action team with my architectural background. I was looking forward to being on the client side of the table for once and put their architects through the ringer. And I guess I asked a lot more questions than anybody expected, and I just kept asking them. And at some point, the superintendent said, "You would just stop asking these questions. Maybe you could just do the work." And so we ended up partnering with another firm that had an education specialty and got that work. And that was really a momentous change in my career. I fell in love with what was possible working with educators, and convinced the partners at this place to give me a shot at building that market. And they were gracious enough and had the courage to allow me to do that and supported me in those efforts. And we are here 8 years later with a pretty great portfolio, one that I'm proud of, that we've accomplished some great projects in the educational market sector.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I always like hearing how people have taken their experience in other ones and brought it into education. What were the surprising things for you when you started digging into those projects in education that either you weren't expecting or crossed over?
It was the crossover that was surprising. The reality of the elements and the characteristics that make spaces ideal for healing and providing care in healthcare are the same elements and characteristics that make learning more effective and allow kids to absorb information in a more efficient manner, and also allow educators to deliver that education and that information in a more effective way. So these, and at the same time, I'm working with a workplace studio that's discovering the same kinds of aspects and characteristics of the environment. And so this all kind of centered on my ethos that space is not neutral. It's either helping your objective or it's in the way of your objective. There's no middle ground to that. And that translates from healthcare to workplace to education and in many other fields as well, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that kind of that healthcare of like the healing and components and how that played in schools.
I should say at the outset, I'm not a researcher. I am not a scientist. I'm a consumer of information. And so in the 1980s, there were studies done about a patient room, and they put patients with similar afflictions with similar care regimens in similar patient rooms, similar furniture. The difference being their availability to natural light and a view out a window. So in one room, they had a window, but that window looked out onto either a parking lot or maybe even a brick wall across a courtyard kind of a thing. And in the other room, it looked out onto a meadow. And they did this repeatedly and kept track of the quickness in healing, the time that it took somebody to get better from whatever the affliction was. But they also kept track of the medication, the pain meds that were requested by those patients. And that was really the interesting piece for me. And as you can imagine, the patient in the room with the beautiful view to the meadow asked for far fewer pain medications, and their stay time was much shorter. So working with healthcare officials, there is a business model associated with this. The quicker they can turn over that room and get another patient in that's billing another insurance carrier for their stay there, the more money they can make. And so that was a real game changer for the healthcare market to take advantage of that, try to improve care and recovery. At the same time, there was a study done of the caretakers, the practitioners, and their environment and what they were going through. And it became very clear that the fewer, nurses are on their feet the entire shift, and it's a long shift. And so if you stretch these patient rooms out over a long, arduous corridor, they wear down much quicker. But if you can shorten that, if you can reduce steps between their stops in throughout the course of their shift, you can really increase the care that they're able to provide. They're in a different mindset when they come into the room. They're going to greet the patient in a different way. They're going to have a different kind of bedside manner because the fatigue is not going to be a barrier for what they're trying to do. And I think that has an absolute correlation to the education market too. Teachers, it's a bit different because they are somewhat sedentary sometimes in their classrooms. And so it's maybe kind of the opposite trend is we want to get them moving to reduce some of that fatigue of just sitting in the same space and becoming zoned out to their surroundings to keep that inspiration, that energy high. And that also has a direct correlation to the kind of education that they're delivering. So all of these things I found fascinating, the overlaps. And I think that the market that you're practicing in becomes less important than what you're trying to accomplish for the people that are occupying those spaces.
Yeah, and those perspectives, I always like that, and I need to make sure that I'm surrounding myself with those other perspectives because we just focus in K-12 schools.
Yeah.
So in our work, and you can kind of get blinders on when you're doing that. So I always like that when we do get pulled into different ones, even though we're not proactively, but to get into kind of college and the corporate and some government and some different areas, there's so many learnings. But I also just feel like I have to purposely seek other things to be able to be trying to find out what's differently. Right now I'm fascinated with the co-working setups that are going on all over the country, because
I think there's a lot of evidence of some real value to that. We practice in a multidisciplinary practice here, so I'm exposed to those different methodologies and kinds of thinking every day, and I absolutely think that's an asset, not one that was I didn't seek out or set out to have that, but it was something that we evolved and developed the K-12 practice within. And so it was always an influence that we had to take advantage of.
Yeah, that's great. So give me an idea, what's the current landscape on schools in Western Pennsylvania right now? You said you do, that and a little bit into West Virginia. Like what's, if somebody from, different part of the country was just trying to figure out like what's going on? How would you explain kind of the current situation?
I'd probably start very simply by saying we're behind. And I don't know that there's any one person to blame for that or any one market to blame for that. There's a funding shortage that has precipitated that. I think the way in which Pennsylvania arranges our districts, every community is effectively its own district, whereas some states have these super districts with 40, 50 high schools within one district. Most districts in Western Pennsylvania have one high school, one middle school, maybe 3 or 4 elementary schools that feed that middle school and high school. And so you get a lot of redundancy in administrations and all of the structure that's associated with a school district happens, 44 different times in Allegheny County alone. And every county is kind of following that same structure in Pennsylvania. And each of those districts are really self-funded. So there's a school tax function that's a piece of your property tax, and that is what develops the district's budget. And so many schools in this area were built in the 1960s and 70s. I don't think we're unique in that. There seemed to be a real boom in education construction in that era, but the replacement has been very slow and has really only been achieved in more of the affluent neighborhoods because they're the ones that can have higher property taxes, and then that precipitates a budget that can absorb some of the costs of school replacement. So we see a lot of renovation, and we see a lot of schools in desperate need of renovation and replacement, and we're not getting that because of all of the barriers that are in place in Western PA. Mm-hmm. So we're behind, and that's one of the reasons when I was brought into my home district to be involved on the design team and really figure out what was right for our community. I brought in an architect, a partner from Tacoma, Washington, knowing that in my studies that the kind of schools that they were designing and building on the western side of the United States were far more progressive and far more innovative than what we had as a portfolio of building catalog that we had in Western PA. And that was a really needed influence in this area. And we're starting to see some trickle down effect of that. And we're seeing more people being exposed to that, not to suggest that we were the first and only in this area, but we were certainly an early adopter of a lot of these concepts that we're seeing starting to take hold and starting to spread across in the few opportunities that exist in the school design market here.
Yeah, I'm going to go a couple different directions in there. So one, if we just kind of look at the funding and kind of the state of the facilities that, if they were built in the 60s, 70s are getting to the point where they're getting towards the end of their life cycle, or they need major
they passed
upgrades.
That years ago, and they're just limping along.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, it's really up to every community to come up with the funding required, and obviously it makes sense if you're in a wealthier area. It's a lot easier to have the money to do that.
It is absolutely a landscape that magnifies the haves and have-nots equation. It's really challenging. Now, the governor just came out and last year, I think one of his first initiatives after being elected was to say that this structure of funding is not compliant with the state's mandate, and went so far as to say it's illegal. But the next part of that is, what do we do now? If we determine that this is not fair and not equitable, what are the solutions for that? And we are not seeing those solutions coming quickly because they're heavily complex. It's not an easy answer.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. It's got kind of to the governor at the state level, because obviously every state's a little different, but that does not sound that abnormal from my experience in most of kind of the Midwest and kind of Northeast.
Okay.
Yeah, where it is very much local property tax. And then, there are certain states where they do take on a little bit more of initiative and say, hey, we're gonna at least partially fund things from the state.
Yeah, there was a program historically called PlanCon that districts could apply for, and I believe there was an equation, formula about how much funding would take in place, and I think it was need based in many ways. But that they ran out of money to fund that program. It's been on a moratorium for since 2016, I think. I might have my dates a little bit wrong, but it's been on a moratorium for a long time. And there's every year talk about reinvigorating that program and injecting more dollars into that program to help make up this gap. But we've not seen any policy, any budget come through with that provision. There are some grants that are being made available that is helping, but again, it's going to lead to, I believe, more Band-Aids as opposed to long-term solutions. And this can is going to get kicked down the road time and time again with a lot of the districts that have need without the resources to fill that gap.
Does it seem like the communities are on board recognizing that we're either going to have to spend a lot of money to either kind of upgrade, maintain existing ones, or we're going to have to spend that money on reimagining what's the next move?
It's a tough sell, and I think that responsibility is on the architectural team's shoulders in large part, because there has to be a value equation brought forward. The thinking is that if you build new and better schools, then you're going to have a more effective educational system. You're going to have learners come out of that system more positioned to enter the workforce or enter their higher education objectives. And then that has a trickle down effect, and more successful outcomes bring more success into the community, more resources, more money, et cetera. So that's the long game, and I think there's absolute value to that. But at every board meeting, there's the family that's there demanding that we not raise taxes. And no matter what the story is, or no matter how high-arcing your ambitions are and wanting to make a difference and make people's lives better, at the end of the day, it's about raising taxes, and $20 a month more for families in or at the poverty line is a big deal. And I think our school boards are sensitive to that, and rightfully so, and are very slow to want to raise taxes to fund just a building. They have to raise taxes to pay for increased utility bills. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the ripple effect of that, if you say we can barely pay our own bills, and yet now you want to take on an $80 million construction project, that doesn't even seem realistic in a lot of our communities.
Right.
So these are challenges and obstacles that exist here. And yes, it affects my business, and I'm sensitive to that, but it really affects our kids. And trying to make the argument to invest in our kids is absolutely the fight I'm willing to take on. And so many other design professionals in this area are taking on that fight, but it's a tough one, and we don't win every time.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder that it's a system. Like it's not.
We're one piece of that.
One piece of that. The legislation and getting the communities and being able to tell the stories and be able to clearly present what those options are. Either we try doing something now or we wait. And
right.
I'm with you. It is trying to look at where is the next thing. Is it at a state level? Is it a federal level? And
all this conversation has a negative tone to it. That there's so many different obstacles in place. But I should say that there are examples of amazing educational facilities being built in this area. There are examples of communities getting over all of those barriers and achieving the right things for their kids. And my school district, Chartiers Valley, I think is a prime example of that. There are others around our area that have done great things. Even if they haven't been full replacements, they've done a new STEM lab, they've done a new esports facility, a new commons area, makerspace, things like that really do make a difference. And if they can't do the big thing, they can focus on some little things and still make great positive impacts. And we're excited about every opportunity that we get to be a part of those as well.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into that second piece I want to ask is, what were those influences that you were trying to take from outside, whether it was more from kind of West Coast, Washington, What were those elements that really stuck out to you that you wanted to make sure that you introduced in Western
Yeah.
PA?
I mean, it's really started with the history of what educational design looked like in this country 100 years ago and why it was developed that way and what it evolved into in the 1940s and 50s. We had the baby boomers and we had a huge influx of students and we needed a place to put them. And so this mass production model of, and now it's kind of called cells and bells, where you've got a corridor with classrooms on either side and you go in a very linear fashion through the course of your day from math to science to English. And you come out the other end and you're ready to go right into the factory and go to work. That is representative of many schools in this area following that blueprint. And what I became exposed to on the West Coast are areas where they talked about small learning communities, where they didn't talk about math being very separate from art, but math requiring art to be effectively delivered, and science in the same vein, and English and language arts being a part of that mix too. So when you have those different influences in the same small community, you're able to make some of those connections and that cross-disciplinary, as I talk about a cross-disciplinary practice, they're talking about a cross-disciplinary education experience that really requires a different kind of building layout to make that effective. So that was a big driver for sure. Thinking about the spaces in between scheduled area, where that information that they've absorbed in this 40-minute class time is really cemented, and they really start to question those ideas and have conversations with their peers about what they learned and what they heard and whether they maybe disagree with that or agree with it. That happens many times outside of the classroom. And so being intentional about the spaces that you're providing for that kind of learning to occur was a big influence on what we were trying to accomplish. The awareness of the need for outdoor space, that connection to nature. Yes, a window is great and natural light is great, but boy, if you could just get outside, you've accomplished all of that in one fell swoop. And so while we have winters here, and we're having one right now, it's not inappropriate to think about the outdoors as another tool for learning that we should be building into our schools. So
and it's amazing. Like the landscape there is just beautiful too. I mean, just rolling hills. Like there is so much that you can incorporate.
Yeah, and geography. I come from Canada. It was minus 47 at my parents' place last week. Ridiculous. I don't know why people still live there, but they do. But I always say, weather is a clothing decision. If you want to teach outdoors, you can teach outdoors. Wear a coat. I never went to high school without a coat on. I don't think my kids own a coat. And like if they do, they live their lives trying to prove they don't, because they never wear a coat to school. So it's just, there's a cultural piece to outdoor learning that you have to get over, but it's easy if you want to do it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I appreciate you giving the landscape of what's going on in the work that you're doing. And because it really is, it's like trying to get kind of just the community of the change makers that are going on and saying like, hey, we need to do better. We can do better. And let's put
then point to examples of other places that are doing better. And I think that's another big piece of our practice is bringing that kind of awareness. We start our building projects with benchmarking tours where we visit other communities that have maybe not the whole thing, but a couple of pieces of it, and we can evaluate it and talk to the end users that are in that space and they're using it every day, and what's working, what's not working, does that work and does that match what we're trying to accomplish? Establishing a clear set of values and guidelines that really keep you on track, because you understand a building project of $80 to $100 million, there's going to be some curveballs thrown at you along the way, and if you don't have that North Star kind of keeping you on track of these important principles in the design, then it's too easy to get off track.
Yeah, that's exactly what I love about working in this education, and then the Association for Learning Environments, and just every one of these projects, everyone's so willing to share with what they've already done so that other people can learn and apply that to the next project.
Yeah, well,
you don't get it in every industry.
I think it's important to admit that no one's the owner of these concepts. No one's the inventor of this thing. We don't hold patents on these things. It's not a one-size-fits-all equation either. I certainly have a palette of characteristics and features that I like to bring forward, but they're not right for every community and they're not right for every faculty. and certainly not right for every student body. Age has a lot to do with some of these things, and just figuring out where you want to land on some of these different kinds of spaces. So you have to think about all of that and figure out together and collectively and collaboratively what's right for this community, with this faculty, with this student body. And that's an individualized conversation every time. And it's a new conversation every time.
Yeah. Well,
but you can't get there without the exposure to all of these other things. And I think that's one of the great things about A4LE is really bringing that exposure to as many people as possible, more so than I would be able to do on my own, or any one firm could do.
Yeah, well, perfect. For the listeners, I hope there's some nuggets in here that help, that you can apply to the work that you're doing in that essence. And if you're not already a subscriber, hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. And just help us spread the word. BetterLearningPodcast.com. These are the conversations that we want to help for the industry, and overlap that with the educators by hitting the school leaders with the Education Leaders Organization, as well as trying to get the message out to the general public. And that's some of the work that we're doing with the nonprofit Second Class Foundation. So BetterLearningPodcast.com is really the hub for all of this. If you have any questions or suggestions on topics. Matt, great talking to you. I really appreciate getting to know you a little bit more and the work you're doing, and I'm sure we're going to run into each other in other areas here. So thank you.
I hope so. Thanks for having me, John.
The views and opinions expressed in the Better Learning Podcast are those of myself as an individual and of my guest, and do not necessarily represent the organizations we work for, the Association for Learning Environments, K-12, Education Leaders Organization, or Second Class Foundation.